Welcome to What Just Happened, a panel discussion about one of the most consequential votes of 2024, brought to you live from the Rothermere American Institute at Oxford University, in collaboration with the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism. Our panel of experts includes Mike Murphy, veteran Republican strategist and co-host of the podcast Hacks on Tap, known for his work on the George H.W. Bush and John McCain campaigns. Kimberly Johnson, the John G. Wynant Visiting Professor of American Government, whose work focuses on racial, ethnic, and suburban politics. Jason Casellas, Associate Professor at the University of Houston, an authority on Latino and local politics, and a member of the ABC News Election Decision Desk. And Claire Malone, a staff writer for The New Yorker with an extensive portfolio of presidential campaign coverage, known for her sharp analysis on media and political trends. The discussion will be moderated by Adam Smith, director of the Rothermere American Institute, Oxford's Edward Osborne Professor of U.S. Politics and Political History, and host of the podcast, The Last Best Hope. If you're joining us on Zoom, please feel free to submit your questions using the Q&A function. And if you're in the room or joining us via another platform, use the QR code to submit questions via Slido. But for now, here's Professor Adam Smith to help us figure out what just happened.
Everybody, whether you're joining us online or in person here at the Rothermere American Institute in Oxford, and as our nifty little intro video told you there, if you would like to submit questions, they're going to be fed through to me. So if you're watching online on Zoom, please do use the Q&A function. If you're watching on another stream, or if you're here in the room, use the QR code. If you're here in the room, the QR code will be flashed up on the screen now and then, and there are pieces of paper with it on by your seats. We have a very distinguished panel. I imagine that few of them have had many hours sleep in the last few days. I certainly haven't. And maybe many of us here are still feeling a sense of shock. Mike Murphy, I want to begin with you, if I may. I mean, the question of this panel is what just happened, and you know, some of us might want to insert an expletive after the. Was this an election that genuinely could have gone either way? Should we be having a discussion now about things that the Harris campaign did wrong? Or now that we know the results, does this strike you as being one of those big wave elections that was determined long in advance?
I think it's more the latter, and I'll try to explain at least my view about it and why a lot of the punditocracy here got things so wrong. But I want to begin by saying thank you for including me in the program today. We like to do elections to make sure our European friends and allies are watching. So I'm sure this one woke some people up. It was kind of unexpected. There was a bit of a battle in the consultant world between how do you look at this election. Theory one was it's going to be a normal election. The polling number we spend a lot of attention to is what we call the right track, wrong track. Are things going in the right direction, or are they pretty seriously off on the wrong track? And that number was between 64 and 70%, depending on the poll. That's an angry electorate ready for change. The debate came, well, classically, that means the party in power gets wiped out. But we're very sophisticated, and so we're going to try to find a new theory based on, you're always looking for this time it's different. And the new theory was, well, Harris is not Biden. She's generational change. She'd break a glass ceiling. She's just different enough that she can go sell, I'm new, and I am a tone change from Donald Trump. It's Ted Lasso versus Voldemort. Also, in the last couple of elections, there has been the Democratic participation has tended to spike a little above prediction based on energy behind the Dobbs decision on limiting abortion rights. So on all those, and a more competent campaign and significantly more fundraising, and Donald Trump having, by normal standards, the worst closing week in recent American political history, doing essentially a Bund rally at Madison Square Garden and then a bunch of meltdowns, where she was having record crowds. So people decided, you know what, because he's Trump and not a generic Republican, there won't be a wave election. And of course, the American voters, who often don't fall for such sophistication that the wine and cheese cohort in Washington and New York do, reacted the other way. And Trump not only won a big red button, fire them all election, mostly on anger over the economy and inflation, prices touch voters. He made incredible inroads with Latino voters, with young voters. Many of his numbers are going back beyond 16 of Hillary to 20-year highs in some circumstances. And I'll finish by just saying one of the biggest process we now know phantoms of this election was, and identity is a big part of how politics is discussed. Maybe we've learned too big. The gender gap, more women vote than men, and all the women are going to vote for her. Well, now that we know from the exit polling, and we're still counting some votes in the West, Donald Trump won men by approximately 13 points. Kamala Harris won women by 8 points. Trump's gender advantage with men was significantly higher than her gender advantage with women.
Claire Malone, I don't think it's necessarily fair to say that you're part of the wine and cheese circuit, but you are a journalist. Did you feel from your reporting, did you sense this anger in the electorate that Mike Murphy has described? Does this election make sense to you, at least in retrospect, or are you still trying to make sense of it?
I mean, what's interesting is I actually don't think this election result was a surprise at all. I mean, it was certainly surprising, I think, to people that it was called so early, but the polls were close the whole time. I mean, Trump, who was, has been convicted of a felony, who we spent, the past 4 years talking quite a bit about, and was a person who was running a very, I think, a more professionalized campaign in some ways than he had run before. And it was always a close election. And the polls told us that till the very end. So the result wasn't surprising. And we had also been seeing all these shifts demographically among Latino and Black men. And I think the big story demographically, in a lot of ways, are those shifts of working class voters of all races. And there's, I'm not the person to go into the specifics about the Latino vote, but there are lots of interesting things about the way Latinos feel about assimilating into American society, and the way that, people kind of hew to the political norms of the geographic areas where they live. So in a lot of ways, this election was, we in the media, maybe, I guess, prepared the readers of elite newspapers and and magazines who maybe supported Harris for this result. But I think, my takeaway of it is, in some ways, and maybe this is too blunt of a way to phrase it, but this election is sort of it sort of reveals a little bit of a class war in American society. And I think you did see a lot of voters in particularly, I was out in Pennsylvania a couple of weeks ago, and you see a lot of, people who think of themselves as Kennedy Democrats saying the Democratic Party just isn't, it's just not in my bones. It's not the party of my father or mother. They just don't get me, and it's so much of politics, I think, is, my phrase is always political pheromones. Do you like the cut of the candidate's jib? Do you want to have a beer with them, is the kind of trite thing that people say. And it doesn't have a lot to do with policy. I mean, Trump sort of overwhelmed traditional GOP platforms, but he kind of, his affect is that of, I'm for the working man, union rank and file, even if the leadership of unions still support the Democrats, a lot of rank and file union members support Trump. It's a cultural identification more than anything else. And I think that's something that's really come to bear. And this is just a massive, it's a change election, a seismic demographic change election.
Jason, perhaps you can put some numbers on this for us. You work on Latino politics specifically, but you've been all over the data in the last few days. Can you perhaps flesh out the point that Claire was making there about the underlying demographic shifts that have become so visible in this election?
Right. I mean, we've seen sort of the Latino vote, shift in many ways towards the Republicans in recent years, and so it's not something that's new. In fact, I've been tracking it, and I have a forthcoming book coming out on these shifting allegiances. So to me, of course, this wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise, I think, was how quickly the shift is materializing in some areas. For example, in Texas, uh, Trump won 55% of the Latino vote, which is the first time. Even George W. Bush didn't win the majority of the Latino vote in Texas. So it's a big change that's happening. And if you look at the South Texas counties in the last election, these are the counties that are adjacent to the Mexican border. 14 out of the 18 counties went for Trump this year. And 4 years ago, it was only 7 out of the 18 that went for Biden. And so what was surprising to me in many ways was not so much that these shifts are happening, but that they're happening so quickly and so rapidly. And I think one of the things that we need to sort of pay attention to, and as Claire just mentioned, is that for many of these working class Latinos, they don't see issues. They don't see that the issues Democrats are talking about appeal to them. In Texas, we had a Senate race, which was, of course, it was seen as very competitive. And the Democratic candidate, Colin Allred, spent a lot of time running ads on abortion, for example. Trying to, I think, appeal to suburban women to get them to turn out to vote, for him. But in many ways, that it probably turned off a lot of Latinos, especially Latino men, and sort of that these kinds of issues just don't speak to them. Working class pocketbook issues were just not seen, were just not discussed in many ways. And I think that's something that Democrats need to reckon with. And of course, nationally, you did see as well these shifts among the Latino vote going towards the Republicans, not just in Texas, but in other parts of the country. In Florida, certainly it's become, used to be a swing state. We think of Florida 2000, right, as being such a short, such a small margin there. And now it's just you looked at Miami-Dade County, and it's just been overwhelming Republican support there for Trump as well. And so one of the things that I think we need to also look at is the down ballot races. For many years, Republicans weren't running candidates in Latino majority districts in South Texas or in other parts of the country. And now they're starting to do that. And so we're seeing more and more Latinos getting elected to state legislatures and congressional seats. And so as we see more and more of this happening, there doesn't appear to be a sign of any kind of backtrack on this. So Democrats need to, I think, be worried about these shifts and try to figure out strategies to try to compete.
Jason, can I just also ask you specifically about the African American vote? How does it? Can you tell us from the numbers how big the shift towards the Republicans appears to be in the
Yeah, for the shift for black men was very minimal. I think it was more hyped than what turned out to be. And with black women, there was a couple percentage points towards Harris. So certainly with African Americans, you did see strong support for Harris. But again, I think the enthusiasm was not as strong as it was certainly for Obama in 2008 and 2012. And so the Harris campaign, I think, I had a lot of difficulty getting African Americans excited about her candidacy. And I think it's partly to do with, the fundamentals of the race, as we've already discussed, right? The economy, inflation that disproportionately affect working class people. And that includes many African Americans. And so many kind of thought that the campaign wasn't focusing on these issues, but rather on kind of these other cultural issues, especially abortion and abortion rights, which again matters to many people. I'm not saying it's not an important issue, but in terms of appealing to certain working class demographics, it may have made sense to branch out and focus on those bread and butter issues.
And turning to you, Kim, in the room, Kimberly Johnson, I've noticed as someone who writes about politics and elections that there's sometimes a tendency when campaigns are going on, narratively, the media is invested in the idea that everything is at stake, that candidates really matter, that campaign decisions matter, that the turnout game matters. After elections are over, and especially elections that are, it's not a landslide exactly by historic standards, but it's a decisive win. After elections are over, there's a tendency to say, well, This was always clear in advance, and these are the demographic shifts. So I suppose that's just a prelude to asking you the same question that I asked Mike Murphy at the beginning there. There's obviously both is the answer here, but in the balance of how far we should put the weight on things that could have been done differently and how far this was out of reach in the end for Kamala Harris, what would you say at this point?
I mean, I think, what most people are saying is that she made the best of a bad situation. I mean, Biden leaves very late in the game. And she wasn't a particularly popular vice president. I mean, so, and not really very well known. So I think that part of the issue for her was that people just didn't know who she was. And I think that the way that she crafted or tried to craft a sense of excitement was, I think, exciting to the media. They like spectacle, but I don't think it necessarily resonated with the sort of average working class person. I think the other thing that I thought was unfortunate towards the end of the campaign is the way in which she brought in Obama to kind of basically scold African-American men. I think that in some ways it did sort of signal this kind of sense of the Democrats, and this is the story that's going around, right, that the Democrats are out of touch and sort of elite, and they're sort of seeing themselves as people who are going to go in and kind of fix working class folks. And so I think I think what's interesting is looking at some of the data, looking at the shifts in cities, like in places like Brooklyn and Queens, shifting to the Republicans. I think that the issue of immigration was huge. I think that in many ways, the sort of push, the sort of movement of immigrants to Chicago, to New York, and they end up in African-American neighborhoods or adjacent to, and really puts a huge strain on neighborhoods and on budgets. I think that was sort of the sense of anger that, wait a minute, we've been here, and suddenly immigrants are here, and they're kind of taking up resources, and you're not listening to us. And so I think there was a disconnect between, again, I think Democratic elites and kind of what was happening in certain communities of color.
Mike Murphy, back to you. I mean, you're a never Trump Republican. I've been enjoying your podcast for many years, as I'm sure many people in this room have. You don't need, you are among the most articulate and amusing people in explaining why Donald Trump is unfit to be president, and you've been doing that since 2015. And my question is why is the majority of the American electorate apparently just not buying that? I mean, they know who he is now, and they've voted for him anyway. Why have people with your view of Donald Trump so evidently failed to get the point across?
No, we've massively failed. In fact, if you look, at least based on the exit polling, Trump got probably 95% of the Republican vote. The whole thing of the Haley voters and all that, the whole never Trump world that I'm part of, we had absolutely no traction. And it's a reminder that often, we have a business in the United States of covering the process of campaigns. We have multiple cable channels. There's just a tremendous amount of content because you've got a big chunk of people on each side who kind of look at it like sports, and they want the daily poll, and they want the daily coaches poll, and they want to see inside a phony focus group that some cable network creates. There's a huge appetite for it, and that tends to put a lot of focus on, this election reminded us that core issues count. My friend Paul Begala, the former Clinton strategist, has a funny line I steal all the time about inflation and how deadly it is with voters. Because you're watching the groceries cost a little more every few weeks, and when those prices go up that you deal with in your daily life, those retail prices, average American goes in, by the way, with a car that's 5 years old, says, I'm paying $320 a month, I want a new version of this car. I guess it'll probably be $400, and right now they would say, no, it'll be $650. That's the president's fault. When you get a raise, that's you. I'm a great worker. I finally got the raise I've earned, and now the money doesn't mean anything because of that damn fool in the White House. So we tend to over-sophisticate this stuff and try to find these. If you look at what the process media talked about, and we did it on Hacks on Tap, we talked a lot about the Dobbs decision and the gender gap. One of the big theories was that her gender gap with women will be equal or better to Trump's and more women vote. Well, that was not true. We said, boy, I'll tell you, she's going to get all the college educated voters, white college educated voters, because there's really been a shift there. Not so true. Among white college educated, she was 7 points up. Among white non-college educated, more blue collar workers, Trump won by 34%. That's his base, and he crushed with it. He was expected to win that, but not to be single digit competitive. And, I mean, the list goes on. I think Jason made a good point. The African American voters are not that special. They're just at the low end of normal. That was not where this race was won or lost. But with Hispanic voters, we've gone from a 33% margin to, at least in the exits, about a 7% margin. That's crushing change there among the most dynamic and rapidly growing vote. So, I'm a white wine and cheeser, and we've got these complicated, it's all about democracy arguments about Trump's character. But to the average voter, they're like, look, all I know is everything cost too much and things were better under Trump. And I don't really know her and I don't really like her, but I want to change and I want to punish somebody, and they're the party in power. So this thing was reduced. It's a lot like the Carter race in 1980. When Jimmy Carter was an incumbent president, he was unpopular. There was inflation. He's running for re-election. And the Carter campaign said there's no way a senile old movie actor who made movies with chimpanzees in Hollywood and has right-wing nut opinions and everything is ever going to win. And the country hit the big red ejector button. A bunch of Senate seats went Republican that weren't, quote, supposed to. So I think the lesson in this is for regular voters, big, simple stuff counts. The other lesson is the Democrats, I mean, American politics has been like a two-lane highway. In one lane, you have a lot of people who used to be Democratic, belong to non-public employee unions, the United Auto Workers as opposed to the teachers union. They're going toward Trump based on populism at 100 miles an hour. You see Latino voters. The Democrat theory has been, well, we'll appeal to them on identity. The Republicans are, screw global warming. You're making 29 bucks an hour in the South Texas oil fields, and it's working. On the other side, the white college educated vote that used to be pretty reliably Republican is racing over toward the Democrats because they resonate to all the arguments that we like to make about Trump being unfit. But fundamentally, the meat and potatoes election was all about firing Biden, and Trump, though he was not that popular, was still seen as acceptable. I think one thing, because Trump is kind of so scary, a thing you have to understand, he's been such a pop culture thing in the US for so long, a lot of American voters discount some of his rhetoric. If you read it literally, you think, my God, it's a madman. And again, I can make that argument, I often do. But the average American voter thinks, oh, he's a condo salesman and he's a TV entertainer, and that's just his way of getting attention. He won't do that, et cetera, et cetera. In 2016, when he beat Hillary, and Kamala's numbers in this election look a lot like Hillary's. We've kind of gone back to the future a bit. The big, in all our secret Republican polling, it was amazing how many regular suburban Republicans then were for him on the theory, their perception, that being reality in American politics, what is perceived to be true, was that he was such a successful businessman, he alone will be able to make dysfunctional Washington work well. He'll sit them down and straighten them out. Now, that, of course, was the opposite of the outcome we got. But as the Democrats learned in 80 with Carter, when you're ready to fire everybody who's there and you figure, well, it can't get worse, and in Trump's case, they had a memory, maybe selective, of it can get better, they're willing to take quite a chance. They lower their threshold of acceptability quite a bit. And that's the election we just had. And it has put stunning many Democrats, horrifying many, I think. The Republicans are a whisper away now from having control of the entire apparatus of our divided government. They're definitely going to win the Senate with a bigger margin. The House is too close to authoritatively call, but the signs are we're no more than 48 to 72 hours that they'll have a slight lead in the House. So it's not only going to be Trump, it's going to be maximum Trump. And we're seeing how much of it is, Trump the bullshitter TV entertainer, and how much of it is an agenda in the policy details that would trouble a lot of people.
Claire, so thank you, by the way, for people in the room and online who are submitting questions. We're getting loads of questions in, and I'm going to try and pull some of them together and paraphrase them. But there's several people. Beth, for example, is asking, and this is a question for you, I'm going to direct to you, Claire, about as it were, the narrative significance for Democrats of the fact that Donald Trump has won the popular vote. The only other time since 1988 the Republican president candidate has won the popular vote was 2004. And I think it was quite important to Democrats to be able to explain away the Trump victory in 2016 by saying, well, he didn't win the popular vote. This is all to do with the Electoral College. It was a fluke, fundamentally. They can't use that argument now, Claire. And I wonder what you think are going to be the consequences of that realization.
Yeah, I mean, you're already seeing this morning, I have a bunch of tabs open in my browser of the various Democratic strategists trying to diagnose what went wrong and what the party should do now. And I do think, what's one sort of striking thing is the Democrats did go very hard on Dobbs and abortion rights. And ultimately, I think for many voters, who might be theoretically pro-choice, that issue was a bit more of an abstraction, whereas your grocery bill was a reality. And I think, Kim bringing up cities like New York really shifting to the right is so interesting because, the New York newspapers, the sort of, the New York Post was for the past 4 years all about migrants taking over the city. That was a powerful message to New Yorkers. And it's an ugly message in a lot of ways, right? But it's one that speaks to people because immigration is an economic issue for people, right? They see it as, it's the classic thing in America, right? The Irish and Italians who immigrated to America and lived in big cities were told the Black people moving from the South are coming to take your jobs. This kind of stuff animating politics is often very ugly. And I think for the Democrats, they will probably be having this discussion of, how do we do a populist shift in our party? How do we reclaim working class voters? Bernie Sanders and many people who kind of came out of the Bernie Sanders 2016 movement are going to make a big push for that, I think. And what's interesting is now we're going to have a Vice President, J.D. Vance, who has pushed this sort of right-wing populism. And I do wonder what the convergence point will be with the sort of Warren, Bernie Sanders wing. I think that's like an open question. So narratively, I think the Democrats, will have the sort of the pieces pointing fingers at Biden. I think Biden has sort of been made the big villain by a lot of people. He promised to be a one-term president and he reneged on that promise. And I think there's going to be a lot of flack for that. But there's a huge need to rebuild. And I think that is going to be the narrative for a while, which is, how does the party rebrand itself, which is really difficult. Donald Trump is a pop culture figure. He's someone who's been able to really powerfully spread a message of that he is the populist champion. And how do you change that in not just political culture, but popular culture, which is more and more important? People don't read as many newspapers. There's a stunning number of people who are under the age of 30 who get their news from TikTok. That's the thing that I've been thinking in this, day or so after the election is just, who's actually reading good quality news and who actually does need to get it. And, listen, not everyone's going to read a New Yorker story. In fact, very few people will. How do you write root cause stories that maybe not everyone reads the original 10,000 word piece, but how does that reporting trickle down into cable and maybe even into TikTok? I think we also just have to think about the way our citizenry is actually consuming news. So there's just a whole host of things that even if people weren't necessarily surprised by the election results, they do indicate a reckoning in, again, this split in American life, which is between people who have economic opportunity and those who feel the weight of our economic inequality more heavily.
Yeah, Jason, on the point that, building on the point that Claire just ended with there's somebody submitted a question, Anne has submitted a question pointing out that a few weeks ago the Economist featured a special section on the American economy, which is titled "The Envy of the World." The question is, why did the Democrats fail to distill that analysis, that good news story about the macro state of the American economy in a way that was understandable for the electorate, or at least persuasive to the electorate? I mean, is the answer, Jason, that if people are not feeling it, as Mike Murphy was saying earlier, if people are just feeling inflation, noticing inflation in their grocery shopping every week, then those kinds of, you know, economist level stories about the undoubted relative success of the American economy were unsellable, or were there things, or was the Democratic Party not really trying to sell that message? You know, your point about the messaging in the Texas Senate campaign suggests that some of the latter may be at play here.
Right. And if you look at the swing states, you know, the Ohio's, the Wisconsins, the Pennsylvanias, you know, many of these working class people are in places where globalization, you know, has led to really, you know, tough outcomes, right? You see these empty steel towns, and you see a lot of people with jobs, you know, that are very sort of, you know, don't provide a lot of opportunity. And so I think sort of trying to respond to those who have been sort of on the losing end of globalization, and sort of respond to them in a way that, you know, we were thinking about you and we're trying to find ways to, you know, solve these problems. And of course, the vice president tried to do this in Michigan and other places with the auto industry, and sort of Biden has done this as well. But it's just speaking to the concerns of these people. It has been something that's, I think, very, very difficult. And Democrats, well, let me just put it, Trump has done a better job, right, of speaking to the anxieties of these people who sort of been at the losing end of globalization. And so, yes, I mean, if you look at all the economic indicators, you know, stock market and all that, yeah, that sort of throws people in the wine and cheese crowd. Their 401ks accounts are doing much better, but when you're looking at these working class swing voters, right, they're more concerned with the price of a gallon of milk, you know, being more this year than it was 2 years ago, and sort of very easily swayed by a simple message that, you know, when I was president, the prices were lower, and, you know, I will end inflation or whatever, you know, when I become president again. And so I think these kinds of appeals, right, are you know, are very effective. Now, in terms of where the Democratic Party goes from here, right, how do you sort of um, do you respond, and, you know, do you respond to populism's success with Trump with more populism, or do you double down on sort of this technocratic, you know, government that we've certainly had? And it's a tough question, right? Because on the one hand, can you, you know, if you try to be a populist like Trump, you know, will that be convincing to many voters, or will they just see you as, you know, just trying to copy, right? And you saw this with Harris and Trump's proposals on eliminating taxes on tips, for example, right? Which probably helped Trump very well, very much in Nevada, right? A state where you have a lot of industry workers in hotel and gaming industries. And so it can't just be sort of me too, like, yeah, I agree with that, but something I think more thought about and more sustainable.
I mean, Jason, you said that in the Texas Senate campaign, the focus of the messaging, at least the messaging that was visible to you on the Democratic side, was about abortion. But some of the Democrats who lost, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, notably John Tester in Montana, obviously in the latter case in a very Republican state, and I guess in Ohio now, a state that's probably far out of reach for Democrats as well. But there are Democrats, and Joe Biden definitely presented himself, Scranton Joe presented himself like this in 2020, who still very much see themselves in the Kennedy Democratic tradition, who see themselves see the Democratic Party as the party of the people who can authentically represent unionized workers and non-unionized workers in industries that ought to be unionized. Those people have lost as well. So what do you conclude from that?
Well, I mean, you could also look, there's a lot of split ticket voting in those Senate races. You know, Senator Baldwin appears to have survived in Wisconsin, and she actually tried to tie herself to a lot of this populism in some of her ads. And if you look at also Pennsylvania, I don't know if it's been called yet, Casey seems to have done much better than Harris, and sort of he's also that sort of Kennedy Democrat trying to appeal to working class Pennsylvanians. Arizona appears not. Ruben Gallego, the Democratic candidate, looks like he may win that race. So a lot of voters did split ticket. So I think Democrats can do well if they run good campaigns and focus on issues that voters there care about. I mean, certainly if you look at Gallego's running a campaign looking at Latino voters, he made a concerted effort to reach out to Latino men, right? So he was kind of on top of this narrative, right, that Latino men were drifting, and he found ways to appeal to them directly on these economic issues. And so there are some examples of success here in terms of Democrats, appealing to working class voters. And so it's not sort of a lost cause, right? But I think, as you say, right, when you have the fundamentals, leading to Trump winning every single swing state, right, these races became much closer. Like Nevada is another one where the incumbent Democratic senator, looks like she might survive, because of the different campaigns that they ran. And so I think, yes, you point out some examples where some of these Democrats like Sherrod Brown did lose, and he was sort of the quintessential populist, right? The union, working class, had a lot of support with auto workers, but in a state like Ohio, it just was not enough, right, to withstand the Trump popularity. But in other states like Wisconsin, Michigan is another example where the Democrat appears to have won the Senate race. So yeah, I mean, I think that puts it in perspective where we did see, I think, some bright spots for Democrats despite the overall success of the Republicans.
Kim, I've got a question here from Udita about the contrasting the way that the campaigns communicated to the average voter. So Kamala Harris's campaign used a lot of big names. Beyonce, she had the Taylor Swift endorsement. I guess Donald Trump had Elon Musk. I'm thinking as well about the point that Claire was making earlier about the sheer complexity of the media landscape, and that there are ways in which people are communicating and talking to one another that are completely invisible to other parts of the electorate. This is not a wholly new phenomenon historically, but clearly technological change is creating new layers of invisibility. So I wonder if you have any thoughts, now that we know the outcome, about whether the strategies, and perhaps particularly if you wish, thinking about those sort of endorsements from celebrities, how you think they may have played out.
I think what was really interesting, and I say this because I have kind of college-age-ish sons, is Joe Rogan. I mean, I think that was huge. I think that, they're now calling it the manosphere, and these micro targeting of young men, often pushing them into spaces where, the wine and cheese eating folks don't really like. But I think that even in 2016, that's what Trump was doing. That's what his campaign manager was doing. They were going deep down into these message boards and sending these ads into places that you would never expect. And so I think that Democrats, because of their networks, are still very much wedded to kind of legacy media. And I think that it sort of becomes like a kind of an echo chamber effect. They're getting a lot of attention from the Washington Post and New York Times and, lots of great glossy spreads, but they're actually not speaking to the people who are wanting to hear something. I just want to add something else about the technocratic aspect of it, and thinking a little bit, because we haven't really spoken about gender, is I think for both Clinton and Harris, I think there's this kind of problem that they have, right? That they have to be sort of hyper competent. And so then there's a tendency to kind of lean into, I've got a plan. But at the same time, we know that sexism makes people look at a woman kind of saying, I have a plan, as, oh my God, it's mom. And she's like, wants me to do some work. And this kind of hectoring, it's really terrible, all these kind of assumptions. But I think that is something that I think, I'm not even sure Kamala even, or Harris I should say, Harris even kind of thought about that. And should she have done anything about it? And you can't appear emotional because then you're not competent. But if you are hyper competent, well, then you're sort of cold and you're scolding. And so it really is a terrible problem, I think, that both Clinton and Harris couldn't really solve.
Mike, I mean, I'm now going round in the circle again, aren't I? I was going to mix this up a bit, but I've discovered that I'm not. Mike Murphy, I'm going to put to you a question which has been much on my mind, but which has been asked by Bruce about the abortion, and essentially the question is about whether this was the dog that didn't bark. And the question is framed in this way: did Trump's leaving it to the states strategy, his defense of the Dobbs decision, and the fact that in a number of states there were state constitutional amendments on abortion, in the end undermine the potency of this issue for Democrats? I mean, so you could deal, as it were, with the abortion issue on the state level by voting in a particular way in a referendum on a state constitutional amendment, freeing you up then to vote however you like, potentially at the presidential level. Is this, Mike Murphy, what do you think of that theory?
You know, I think it's an interesting question. I think it maybe is a secondary effect. I mean, again, here's an exit. Among people who said the economy was the top issue, Trump won 80 to 19% of the vote. Among people who said immigration was the top issue, he won 90 to 9. Among people who said abortion was the top issue, she won 74 to 25. So she won that vote, but that vote was one of the top issues, but it wasn't the dominant issue to the extent the economy was. So, you know, her store was open on something that was a lesser demand. And there are a lot of states where people feel, well, here in, you know, X, abortion rights are secure. The other thing is the one group of American voters that is totally invisible is pro-life women. Women who favor more abortion restrictions do exist. You won't find them in pop culture, but like an inconvenient fact that political consultants have to kind of deal with is they outnumber African-American women 3 to 1 plus, depending kind of how you ask people a question about, you know, abortion laws. So, you know, you've got maybe 17% of the electorate, maybe 15% who are women who are pro-life. And, you know, they exist. So you never get the 90-10 thing, except, you know, again, among super secular, more metropolitan, highly educated people. So the other thing is there's often an assumption that, well, I'm pro-choice or I'm pro-life, so that's the issue I vote on. We will be able to find in the exits, there were no shortage of pro-choice women who voted Trump on the economy. So, you know, we sometimes force that thing forward. So yeah, it was a bigger issue than I think. It was a big issue, but it was not necessarily a conquest issue that allowed her to overcome the fire the Biden team on the economy deal.
Another question for you, Mike, which this has come from Tom from BBC Verify, who's asking about Trump's campaign strategy and how it differed from the last election, the 2020 election. I don't know whether you think there was a strategy, that at least a strategy as far as Trump as a candidate himself was concerned. But did he do anything differently that worked better this time compared to 4 years ago?
He did, but you know, now being again in this process content business, we're all going to look at the campaigns. The leadership of the Trump campaign was completely convinced he was going to lose for the last 7 or 8 days of the campaign. They were all writing their alibis. I have firsthand knowledge of this. So, you know, now we're going to, here's the genius kid who found a computer that if you hold it upside down was the secret to Latino voters in Muskegon, Michigan. Trump rode a wave. I called it before the election. I said this election was either a combination of small but medium-sized potent forces like Dobbs, like more money, like more professional campaign for Harris, and one big force that Trump did not create, but he's riding on, that is the biggest force. I called it the 100-mile wide wall of lava. advancing 1 foot every hour, very hard to stop. That was fire him on the economy. I should have bet on the lava. I kind of got myself seduced into all the process stuff. So did Trump do anything to create that? No. He just said, remember me, I'm better, I'm change. And he filled the news media every day with kind of insult entertainment. Now, what the Trump campaign did do better, because they can't control him. There are a bunch of people with clipboards following Trump around being yelled at. He kept talking about firing them all, and they thought he was going to lose. The last rallies were crazy. But what they did well was an advertising campaign, because Trump didn't really meddle with that too much. Trump wanted just a microphone and a crowd to do his act, which, worked with disaffected voters who'd had enough with inflation. He was good at it. He knew how to get our cable television business, news business, that'll cover him wall to wall if he gives them conflict. When he ran to 16, Trump got 7 times the free coverage on cable TV of any other candidate. He understands how to tickle that machine, because at the top of Fox and CNN and MSNBC, where I worked for a long time, there are people watching clicks and counting money. So give them a show, they're going to cover you. But the ad campaign also, Harris had a vulnerability which the Democratic campaigns tend to have an operational, I'll call it a cataract about. And I worked for Bush in 1988 when we ran against Dukakis. And we knew certain wedge issues worked with regular voters. And the Trump people were the same thing. When Kamala Harris said, I think it's okay to pay for, sex reassignment surgery to prisoners, the Trump campaign knew we're going to blow that on TV for $30 million and get every steel worker in Michigan arguing with somebody about it. And the Harris campaign are never going to say I was wrong, because their internal world of identity politics will not permit that. They will trip over their own shoelaces. And they ran that ad, I believe, don't have the final data, more than any other ad. And it worked great. They did define her as a left winger. She also had this biography. She's from San Francisco. That has a brand loading in those swing states. People in Michigan do not think San Francisco is full of moderates, or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. So the Republicans know how to run, and the elite media will say, and I generally agree with them, by the way, but they will say, oh, these are ridiculous, nobody cares. It's like the old Pauline Kael joke when she was the brilliant film critic in New York Times. I don't know how McGovern lost. Everybody I know on the Upper West Side voted for him. Well, there are bubbles. And so Trump's campaign was better at that stuff. Now, the other myth that many of us who've done a zillion campaigns are afraid to say out loud, because there's a profit-making constituency that sells this stuff. And the reporters always fall for this. Ground game in a presidential race, not so much in a low turnout race, but ground game in a presidential race is the most overrated thing in the world. Trump did not have a ground game. They had the greatest ground game in the world. They had solar-powered turnout vans. They had all the toys, millions and millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars, blank check, and it was not worth a damn. Because if your message is failing, this turnout stuff is meaningless, color-coded pins on a wall. So the turnout ground game thing, which we must have heard a million times in the coverage, and other consultants disagree. Axelrod and I just stopped fighting about this in a Hex on Tap this morning, but it's massively overrated. All that stuff is a function of how good your message is. And Trump barely had any of it, yet Trump has done the best generally in terms of getting votes in the Republican Party in national election for 20 years now, without any significant paid ground game.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how good your sales force is. If nobody wants to buy, if not enough people want to buy the product you're selling, you're not going to win the
exactly
race.
Right. I used to joke that, hey, our dog food has 1 million trucks, endorsed by Lassie, $3 million jingles sung by Mick Jagger. The problem is you crack it open and no dog wants to eat it.
Claire, I mean, in a way, I'm still circling back on this question of inevitability, or sort of the sense of some big historic movement. People often write about elections using kind of meteorological metaphors like waves and so on, as if there are forces of nature that couldn't be pushed back. And Mike Murphy's just reminded of his of his lava metaphor as well. But as Mike has just said, or I'm slightly putting words into his mouth, but you could not have lab designed a Democratic candidate less likely to appeal to the kind of swing state voters that the Democrats knew they needed to win over than somebody who could be so easily painted as a San Francisco liberal and who was also a woman and who was also a person of color. I mean, do you think that if it hadn't been for the peculiar circumstances of Biden being forced out, do you think Kamala Harris would have got the Democratic nomination in an open primary had Biden kept to his word and stepped down and announced that he wasn't running again back in 2022 or something? Were there other people, potential Democratic candidates in the field, do you think, Claire, who might have made enough of a difference, who might have been able to counter this kind of the juggernaut of all these underlying forces that we've been discussing?
Maybe. I mean, that's the cop-out answer. Who knows? But I do think this goes back to people will have a lot of resentment that there wasn't a sort of more fulsome actual primary. I mean, Kamala Harris did lose in 2019 during the Democratic primary season. She was not seen as a particularly strong candidate. The stories back then about her campaign were not particularly well run internally, and the candidate lacked sort of a she was sort of project onto me what you would like, and people saw that as something that was not to her strengths of questioning people in the U.S. Senate, right? She had a very obvious talent for being prosecutorial at a time when that was really valuable to people on television, right? Wanting to see someone holding Trump to account. I think I think it's an open question as to whether I think the forces aligned against the Democrats were pretty powerful. In an incumbency reaction coupled with Trump and the kind of big movement that he carried with him. But you could say, even it's interesting. After Trump's win in 2016, you saw a lot of people saying, well, women, that woman didn't win. What about, young, moderate white guys? Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania kind of comes to mind. There was sort of this Pete Buttigieg, right? There was this sort of resurgence of maybe we should package this in a more appealing way to working class white voters, right? That was sort of the initial reaction. And there was, I have to say, one of my reactions to the result was, well, I guess we're not going to nominate women anymore. Now, listen, this is, the second day, but now 2 women in a row have lost. And I feel like one of the first reactions against Trump was to say, perhaps we should promote some of these, younger white men. Of course, Elizabeth Warren obviously ran in the primary, and Harris and Gillibrand. And what was notable about that Democratic primary was it talked a lot about, childcare and sort of talking about childcare costs in the U.S. as an economic issue. And I thought that was a really interesting and probably valuable bread and butter issue that really hadn't kind of gotten as much attention from male candidates. But someone like Gretchen Whitmer, you could make the argument, a swing state governor who's pretty popular, maybe someone like her had a chance. I mean, I think she and Josh Shapiro were obviously in that sort of weird period of 12 hours before Harris kind of seemed to lock everything down. Those were the people that everyone was talking about, right? Like swing state governors, competent, popular, maybe those people could do the job. And you could imagine a world where if there had been any kind of primary season for the Democrats in a real way, the people like that might have risen to the top. I think overall, Harris kind of ran a campaign that was fine, right? I think it was fine. I think you can make a lot of arguments that she should have done more press, or maybe to Kim's point, Rogan. I mean, right? Maybe she should have made that final effort to go to Rogan versus SNL. And that's kind of the Monday morning quarterbacking. But I do think the Democrats will probably regret the internal politics of their party and the way it prevented perhaps the vetting that a primary season does to prepare candidates for the general election.
Jason, I want to ask you about generational shifts, and I don't know whether you've got data already, whether you've seen anything in the exit polls that can give us any indication of the numbers of people under 30 or under 40 who voted for Trump. But it seems that there was a movement of young people towards Trump. We have a question from Mark Power-Smith, in fact, on this subject. He calls this one of the most striking things about the election is the Democrats appear to be losing ground with younger voters. Do you have any thoughts about that and how important and why that's happened?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the things that a lot of younger voters, I think, are concerned about is their future, of course. And I think, one of the things that we haven't talked about, I think, is a big issue is housing. And, many sort of, people think that they will never be able to buy their own home because prices in most cities and most places are astronomically high. And you couple that, of course, with high interest rates, and it's just very difficult for people to sort of think about their future in that way, like I will get married and buy a home and sort of that American dream kind of future. And when you see that, housing is just completely out of reach, and you couple that with inflation as well, then, you could see some shifts there with younger voters. In general, though, younger voters don't vote at very high rates. So I don't think that it was a big concern for either campaign, I think, to do a lot of outreach. Certainly the Harris campaign picked up on the student loan issue that Biden certainly tried to appeal to many young voters with, but it didn't seem to really go as far as probably they wanted to get them to go to the polls and vote for them. But I think, this is something Kim alluded to earlier, where young people are getting their news, right, has changed considerably. And many young men, as she mentioned, are looking to outlets like Rogan, and they're getting a lot of their news from those sources. And they're, I think, much more easily swayed, right, to consider different alternatives when it comes to who to vote for. Also, I mean, many of our young people are much more diverse. They don't see either party as demanding their loyalty. I think they're a little bit more freewheeling, and they're more likely to, I think, experiment and go with other, options, and rather than just stick to one political party. But yeah, I mean, we did see shifts, I think, among young people, but in generally most of these demographics that we're looking at, we did see shifts towards the Republican. But, as we've been talking about already, the most dramatic shifts are, in Latinos and Latino men in particular.
Jason, you mentioned the student loan issue, the loan forgiveness issue, and the way you put it there was that maybe the Harris campaign could have pushed it more, or why wasn't it more effective? But I wonder if there's a parallel there with the point you were making earlier about the unintended negative consequences of pushing the abortion issue in the Texas Senate race, which is that for people who don't have a student loan, right, which presumably includes a large proportion of the swing voters that the Democrats needed to capture, this presumably strikes them, I would imagine, as yet another example of privileging one category of person over another, of the basic unfairness which they feel is an obstacle to their success in the United States, just as illegal immigration strikes them as unfair. So, I mean, could you make a case for saying that actually that whole issue of student loan forgiveness was in the end a net liability for the Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that that's right. And sort of that balancing act of trying to appeal to, and let's face it, I mean, young voters are the ones that are less likely to turn out, and you really want to appeal to those swing state voters because those are the people who are going to turn out and vote and can make a difference in the election outcome. And so it makes perfect sense, right, that they would privilege, obviously, not talking about that student loan forgiveness program, but rather kind of keep it under the radar and focus more on these other issues.
We're coming towards the end of our time. I know there are lots of questions that have come in that I haven't been able to get to, for which I apologize. But Kim, as we close, I want to ask you a question. We've been talking about what's happened, a question about what's coming next. We had a question from Cuthbert about what level of influence the Democratic Party or Democratic Party policies might have, if any, in a Congress in which, let's just assume, as now looks likely, that the Republicans control both the House and the Senate, and obviously the White House?
So, I mean, I'm going to use a very old-fashioned term, which is realignment. And so we've talked about this as a wave election, but I think in terms of the Republican control of basically all the branches, we have to think about these institutional changes that then occur, and those institutional changes create a whole new set of policies. And that's what you get. You get a whole new set of politics. And so I think in many ways, it's going to be the Republican decade. But certainly I think politics won't look, how we do things won't look the same as how we did things a year ago. And so I think that it is and I don't think Democrats are going to have much of a say.
And Mike Murphy, big question for a short answer for you about what's going to come next. What is the future of MAGA? I mean, Trump, I think, is probably mortal, assuming the Constitution remains in place. He won't be able to run for a third term. What do you think right now is the future of the MAGA movement in what will one day be a post-Trump world?
Murky. I think Vance will try to grab the mantle. Vance's problem is he's now the son that Trump always wanted, but Trump is Stalin. He doesn't really like other bright lights in the orbit. So if I were Vance, I'd be careful about getting too popular. See how it worked for Steve Bannon, who was out of the White House in a crate the minute he got 3 clips about how he was the brains of the operation. The midterm elections are going to be very key. The most important piece of real estate in the Democratic Party is what we call the D-TRIP, the DCCC, Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Traditionally in American elections, the new party takes a bit of a pounding in the midterms. And Trump, the way he's going to operate this White House, it's a fair bet that he'll get into a lot of controversy. So if the Democrats are smart, they will stop recruiting candidates from the sociology department at Columbia and go wider and try to really run the table. Because if the Repubs get the House, we still don't know, though it's more likely than not. If the Dems can take it back in 24 months, our thing is much different than the UK. The power is distributed. The House runs the checkbook and they run investigations. They will have a lot of power. So it's a great short-term test of their strategic problems. The other thing is Trump was elected on things were better under me. I'm going to put money in your pocket. Well, if he goes into tariff wars, and Trump is a huge deficit spender, he's thrown the old Republican policies out the window, he could get more inflation and he could get a recession, the opposite of what he sold people. And you have a pre-built national protest election only 24 months away. And the sooner the Democrats can be a scary force that they seem to be organizing smart and doing that well, that'll have a curbing influence on the Republican politicians in the Congress, who to thine own political career be true is still the golden rule. So I think MAGA is going to get roughed up a little. I think the best day of Trump's political career was yesterday, and the slope of the decline is the question, and we don't know yet.
And final question for Claire, for you. I mean, every river has its bend and all that, and no election, we think, at least so far, is ever the last election. There's always another day. What's your best guess now, turning to the Democratic Party, for how quickly the Democratic Party is going to be able to pull itself together, deal with what I know from messages I've got from friends is clearly a really traumatic result?
It's a hard question. I mean, I do think there is the midterms do provide in 2 years an opportunity and historically a trend towards the party out of power gets a boost during the midterms. I just think that there's going to be there are lots of factions in the Democratic Party. That is sort of the purpose of the Democratic Party. And, the standard bearer of the populist wing, Bernie Sanders, is elderly. And some of its young stars, AOC, the members of the squad, which sort of seems a bit disbanded, are controversial. So, I think there's going to be a lot of, I'm sure there will be some gains made in the midterm elections, but I think that there is so much to sort out for the Democrats about how to convey a winning economic message without alienating a lot of their progressive constituencies who, the term woke is so overused and frankly, like, derisive in a way that is not useful. But people who are progressives who want to support, LGBTQ rights, like, those are real constituencies in the Democratic Party. The reproductive rights constituency will fight against, falling too far down the ladder, right? And I don't think that's really in danger. I think Democrats are going to really stay on reproductive rights. But there's just something about aesthetically remaking your party and making people feel as if its policies are more in line culturally with their values is just a really stunningly difficult task. And I 2 days out, don't know how they're going to do it and in a quick period of time. And perhaps that's the answer, is that change like that requires a track record that you build over a period of years. And now we will have, 12 years of a Trump era, probably ripe for a reaction and, at the end of a 4-year term. But I feel like the Democrats need to build a track record.
Well, I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time. This discussion will be available online afterwards, and it will also be available we'll put it as an audio in the Last Best Hope podcast. And if you don't already subscribe to the Last Best Hope podcast, do search for it wherever you get your podcasts. But in a moment, those of us who are in the room can come and have a glass of wine. I don't think we have any cheese, but we do have plenty of wine in Oxford. I'm very sorry that the people watching online and our panelists can't join us for a glass of wine here. But I'm extremely grateful to all of you, to Mike Murphy, to Claire Malone, to Jason Casas, and to Kimberly Johnson here with me in Oxford. Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
We're
everyone.
clear, right?
Yeah, good to talk.
Great job, everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Yeah, great job.
everyone.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye,
Take
Caitlin.
care.